but to show that to the student when they're learning how to make an adjective and noun agree would be overwhelming, right? Mm-hmm. That's why we don't point that out. But to point that out to a student after the fact of like, look at what you can do. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. Kids don't know what their peers don't know.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello, and welcome to Classical Etc. My name is Jessica Gardner, and my role here at Memoria Press is at Memoria Academy, where we offer online classes utilizing the Memoria Press materials. And I am here today with Martin Cawthron and Paul Schaefer. And today we're going to tackle a question from someone in the MP community. She is asking for practical advice with her teenager, having a conversation with her student about why she chose classical education. But before we dive in, we are going to talk about what we're reading. So, gentlemen, the question for every episode.
Once again, it's so weird because Paul, the look on his face is the same as I feel, which is always, gosh, why didn't I think of the fact that this was going to be the first question asked? Because we do it every single time.
Are you projecting that feeling onto me? Because that is in fact not what I feel. I just look at you because I know that you feel that way.
But I felt better thinking that. So,
and Martin, I was going to toss it to you first because yesterday we were talking about what we were reading.
What did I say? What was I? What am I reading?
You know what? We were talking about books you were collecting.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm actually, and I may have said this before, I've mentioned this book several times, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning by Nigel Bigger. Mm-hmm. And I think I said it on the show that I finished reading it. I had it all marked up because it was just a great book with lots of really interesting facts in it about British colonialism, and I left it on a plane. I had literally marked it, and I was in the middle of the last chapter, and I left it on a plane, and I was so bummed. And so I ordered the book, and I'm reading it again. That's how very few books would I do that.
I remember you mentioning this book on colonialism, but I did not hear the end of that story before. Mm-hmm. But it's that good for a second read.
Oh, absolutely. Huh. I also, there's always a book I pick to give to my friends during Christmas. And, that's the book. Problem is it's this big and it's a hardback and it's really expensive, but it's worth it. So I'm giving that to a number of people this Christmas. But when there were these Christian revivals in England, and he doesn't talk about this specifically, but it's clearly in the background of this book. They spent 150 years trying to stop the slave trade. They did it. It cost them money, a lot of money. It was like at one point like 20% of their budget. And they did this for no other reason than the fact that they were a Christian country. Okay, that's not good. Okay, I don't understand that. Why is that not a good thing? And in the way, the British, they have this, they're about order and peace and free trade.
Yeah, just bringing nuance to the conversation.
Oh, totally.
Right?
Totally.
I mean, that's that, it doesn't sound like it's a book saying everything was hunky-dory.
Right. They made mistakes, but they were almost all the mistakes were against the policy that the British had. It was the exception and it was not the rule.
Isn't that the human experience though? Yeah. Like our theory is good, and then when it comes down to practice, we really screw it up.
Sounds like a good read.
Yeah, it's a great read. Yeah,
how about you, Paul?
Well, I went back and I mentioned earlier that I had started the Prague Cemetery. And I went back and had to reread the first by Umberto Eco. So he wrote The Name of the Rose, which is a great book.
And you went and read another book after you read that one?
Now I have, so I've got the Prague Cemetery, which was gifted to me, and I have Foucault's Pendulum. So I want to read both of these by Eco because I greatly enjoyed The Name of the Rose, and actually Name of the Rose is on my list to go back and reread. But I started with the Prague Cemetery. The synopsis, I went back and reread the synopsis. I'm like, I have no idea really what this is about. And the synopsis didn't really help me much. So it's going to be like most of the time I like to know where a novel is headed. I have a cousin who she will read the last chapter of a book before she even starts because she wants to know how it ends. I'm not that crazy, but I do like to know like what's the general thrust of the story. I have absolutely no idea, but I've decided to suspend my own issues and just decide I'm going to like be on this journey with this author. But the first chapter is absolutely politically incorrect in every conceivable way.
So love it.
As far as like wanting to know where I'm going, I just said I'm just gonna have to suspend that part and just roll with it and see where we end up.
And speaking of that author, I'm reading a book called The Black Swan. It's one of these books about that sort of question basic assumptions about how we react in society or economically or whatever. And so he talks about echo in that book. And at the very beginning of the book, and it's one of those ones the passages I go and I write down somewhere, which is that what is Umberto Eco's definition, term, anti-library. Are you familiar with it?
I did not know he had this term.
Okay, so what it is, he talks about how, when the person comes into your library and they look around and they said, have you read all these books? And I have been making the point, look, this is not a trophy case. These is my reference library. These are the books I refer to. A lot of them I read, a lot of them I haven't read. And Eco basically says that the more unread books you have in your library, the better the library is. And he calls that the anti-library.
Oh,
and I never heard that concept. And that's what I have at home. I have an anti-library.
There's actually a fascinating little clip on YouTube of, I think it was the BBC that was like doing an interview with Umberto Eco. And like in the middle of the interview, he gets up to go get a book. And they follow him through
this labyrinth
of a library. He's got bookshelves on every side. And he just, without pause, like he walks through rooms and rooms and rooms and finally gets exactly right to the book he wants.
Of course.
I mean, it's amazing. But
it's an improvement on my method, which is to go in there and look around for about 30 minutes till I find one, if I find it at all.
I'm sure, it's evident he's a very well-read individual, but he's
known as a polymath.
But he also knew exactly, like he had his structure in his library. He knew exactly where everything was. I also have a book of his essays, which are more like, most of them are opinion pieces that he wrote opinion pieces in a newspaper for years, an Italian newspaper, and they collected those. And it's funny to me how many times he's ranting about cell phones. It's an enjoyable read because you can kind of see through the 90s, early 2000s, kind of like how he progressively ranted a little bit more. I've enjoyed that too. I pick that up every once in a while. But anyway, that's
a kindred spirit.
Yes. Right now I'm on Echo. That's where I'm living.
Nice.
I read Name of the Rose, but it's a tough read, I think.
Oh, I didn't.
Although it is interesting.
I loved it.
It's a book to think about.
But I feel like The Name of the Rose was a fairly straightforward narrative. And I'm afraid that both The Prague Cemetery and Foucault's Pendulum are not going to be nearly that straightforward, and actually where he's referring to a lot of cultural stuff that I don't know.
Right. And Name of the Rose is a murder mystery, basically, that takes place in the Middle Ages and at a monastery. So a very interesting setting for a murder mystery.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yeah. So I'll have to come back and report on The Prague Cemetery.
You will. Yeah. I just picked up Eric Larson's In the Garden of Beasts. It's a historical account of the first American ambassador to Nazi Germany. And he recounts this man's life in Berlin with his daughter.
This is prior to World War II?
Mm-hmm. So it's in the early 30s.
National Socialists are taking over?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So it's supposed to be, it's detailed, so it'll take me a while.
Is it fiction or nonfiction?
It's nonfiction.
Okay.
So I haven't gotten too far into it, but I'm excited. And I enjoy or like that reading about that period. And it's kind of had a renaissance in the last 10 years. So
yeah, I've actually been surprised. I don't know how I got into this, but I was recently, I watched a couple of documentaries on the prosecution they've done of Nazis like in the early 2000s. Like these guys are in their 90s and they're still going after it. It's
on
fascinating.
trial.
Yeah.
And Eric Larson was, we talked about this the other day, and I had not been aware of him. That's the kind of writer I normally would be aware of. And then I'm looking at all the other books. I'm going, ooh.
Right. Yeah. I think one of his most notable is Devil in the White City. It won a couple awards, I think. And anyway.
Well, Eric Larson's the author of the book that Tanya gave you.
Okay, that's what it is.
And I almost said what the title of that book was, but I guess people could go and look at the
it's the
podcast
same.
episode.
It may be the same book.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. Well, book club.
Book club.
Oh, wonderful. Well, today we have a terrific question from someone in the MP community, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to talk through it on the podcast because it gives us the chance to, with really practical help, do what we love to do, which is equipping our community with information, but also confidence to educate your children classically. So I'm going to read the question from Marian, and she left this on our YouTube channel after our episode on why to teach Greek. So here's what she says. She says, could you do an episode about opening a conversation with high school students to explain why you, as the parent, chose classical education for them? I've been using Memoria Press materials in our homeschool for the past 10 years. And now that my two oldest of 6 children are 15 and 13, I would love to sit down and have a conversation with them about why their education is so different from that of their public school friends and from the education their father and I received in public schools, and answer any questions they have about that. I know I could just wing it, but I would love to hear if the Memoria staff has any words of wisdom to share. Thanks. Well, Marian, you don't have to wing it. We would love to help you. And I have 2 experts for this question, Martin and Paul, because we want to give you, the tools that you need to navigate this conversation. And Paul, I want to start with you. She asked for words of wisdom. You have no shortage, but you are with our high schoolers here at HLS in Louisville every day. Mm-hmm. You see teenagers every day. You're teaching them. Yep. So with them in mind, how would you do this? Where would you start?
Well, that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up because when I was teaching those high schoolers at Highlands 4 years ago, and we were talking about what does it mean to be, and we started talking about, the universals, and then we got to the transcendentals, and we got to beauty, and I was trying to make the point that there can be an objective standard of beauty. It's not just all utterly subjective, and then we got into how, with children, you have to form their appetites, right? You have to get them exposed to the things that are orderly and beautiful and proportional and harmonious, and that's what they learn to love. And the look on these kids' faces were like, you all have been intentionally trying to define what I like. I mean, they were like really taken aback by that thought. Was that, we naturally grow up, I think, in this idea that we make our own choices, right?
Okay.
And we are unaware of the circumstances around us actually influencing who we become. And so, it ended up having to be like a long conversation about, look, yes, I mean, if you were left to your own devices, what would you like? Probably punk rock and, Picasso. I mean, I don't know. But if we expose you to Michelangelo and Raphael and Beethoven and Bach and Mozart, then maybe you don't turn on Mozart when you get in the car every day. I don't, but I do know how to appreciate it, right? Because when I went through school, I was exposed to all that. I spent many, many hours watching performances and documentaries about classical music and understanding how it works. And so I have an appreciation for it in a way that I wouldn't otherwise. But students think that oftentimes they think that they're choosing what they want, but we're intentionally forming them. And that caught me by surprise because in my school, in high school, formation was often talked about.
Okay.
It was often talked about that you're undergoing a process of formation. Everybody has to be formed. And so it was normal for us. But for my students, it was not even on their horizon that education is formation. And so I mean, maybe that is a conversation that a parent would want to start, like dropping little seeds of, we have to, as humans, we're constantly trying to grow. And so you have to be formed into, the kind of person that you want to be. It's not just going to happen to be that way. And if you start dropping those seeds, then when you come to a formal conversation, that thought's already there.
And if the thought isn't there already,
yeah, it's just going to be something where you're like, they might push back on it. I remember the moment I realized that every game in my house as a child, my mother had intentionally sourced and decided whether it could come in the house or not based on whether it was educational. And the first time a game came into the house that was not educational and she raised such a stink about it, I went, what? Like, this time we've had fun as a family playing Pinochle? Like, you were trying to get me to learn to do math? Like that kind of thing. It was shocking to me when I realized that about like 10 or 11 years old. But then when I left, when I went into a private school and the conversation was about formation, then I really got used to that idea.
Well, I forgot what the question was, but what Paul said was making me think that, our students come into our classrooms, even from the most Christian homes, as subjectivists. And I think we have done a good job of addressing the question or making the case that truth is objective, that there are certain things that are, and there are certain things that aren't, and you can feel however you want to about them. But that is the case. But they still come with an idea, I think, that goodness is relative in some way.
And beauty.
That beauty is relative in some way. And I think that's where the battle is, really. You should be able to go from the truth being objective to the rest of those things, but that they don't make those connections. And, to make them understand, and, when you get to upper grades, maybe you're teaching, Plato or something who's addressing particularly the issue of the good, that there is something out there that's metaphysically there, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not. And your responsibility is to conform yourself to that. And then beauty is because beauty is the thing that gets relativized first historically. And it's the hardest one to treat. And yet, if you really think about that, you realize that it is objective. There are some things you can look at. If I could take two things, the Pietà, let's say, by Michelangelo, and some terrible thing, and we'd say, yeah, well, that's beautiful, and that's not. And then you make it more and more problematic, and you're tempted to believe that there's some things that you just can't do. No, there are standards of beauty. There is the beautiful, and it is there, and it's objective, and it's real, just like everything else. It's harder to detect. It's harder to come with good criteria for what that is, but it's ultimately undeniable. And so to communicate to students that that reality is all those things, and that reality is objective. It's there as a certain, and just because people feel differently about it is irrelevant. So that's just my reaction to that situation.
What that brings to mind is the critique my wife levied against the entire classical movement.
Do tell.
When we were dating or newly married. I was newly married, and she was traveling with me to different conferences and conventions, and she was like, everybody here is so arrogant. And while you were talking about, right, objective standards of beauty and truth and goodness, it made me think, right, the very fact that we stand up and say we can know what it means to be good can come across as arrogance.
When in fact, it's exactly the opposite.
Well, and that's the point I wanted to make, because you said we conform ourselves to it.
Right.
And I think
we set our feelings, sometimes our judgment even, aside. That's not arrogance. That's the opposite of arrogance.
But that is, we don't talk about that often.
Yeah.
We just say there is a standard of goodness and we know what it is and we can teach other people about it. No, but if we were to say there is an objective standard of goodness and we have to submit to that, that's where we're going to keep that humility, I think, front and center. And it's an easy one to drop. It's such an easy thing to drop. But yeah, it was an interesting conversation I had with her, because I was just, I was in the community and then she comes from outside and she's like, this is what's going on here. And I was like, oh, and it totally changed my perspective on the way I tried to talk about things.
Yeah. Sure. It's somehow perceived as less arrogant to say, my feeling is more important than the truth itself.
Right.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, but our default mode, right? Going back to the students, their default mode is my subjectivity gets to determine, what something is, or whether it's good or whether it's beautiful, or and then, but it's a work of us helping them understand. To be humble means submitting yourself to those other things, right? And so. That's, I think, why my students were initially appalled at the idea of formation, is because it meant that they would have to submit themselves to an objective beauty and to an objective goodness.
So that's really helpful. And what I'm kind of hearing from you is that this conversation between Marian and her 13-year-old is really a conversation about formation, her intentions, and the big picture of what it's like to grow and develop as a human being. I
would say, that's absolutely a part of the conversation. And that's the part of the conversation that caught me by surprise when I started having it with high schoolers. Now, and those were later high schoolers. Those were juniors, right? I think she said 13 and 15.
Yep.
The younger they are, the more they're going to be open to that idea, I think, because the older they are and the more they're seeing themselves heading towards adult independence, that sort of formation becomes less and less attractive.
And it's not like you're having to say, here's what I'm trying to teach you.
Right.
You just teach it.
So you wouldn't be that explicit.
Well, you don't have to be that explicit because, so for many years, I taught Latin, I taught logic, I taught literature. Okay. And so when you teach Latin, you're teaching grammar and you're uncovering because language, especially to English speakers, seems very subjective, right? It doesn't seem like there are all that many rules and all that. But what Latin does for you is it disciplines your mind by teaching you these rules that underlie all language that you can't deny. Again, there's this objectivity there. There's a structure there that is there even though you don't see it. So you're presenting that to them. So there's an implicit kind of thing that look at the order underneath the language that you haven't really thought about how you do it, right? And then logic, you're talking about the 10 categories of thought, the 5 predicables, the 5 ways of saying something about something else. There are rules underneath. And I think when you have an education like that, you're implicitly getting the idea, there's this thing I thought was just, I was making it up as I was going along, when in fact, there's rules underneath everything. And so I think that just implicitly communicates to students that there is some kind of objective order.
Well, and I think that's actually, to try to boil things down for parents a little bit more, maybe we could extrapolate from that the idea that when, if a parent were to contrast, like, why are we homeschooling you here classically as opposed to sending you to the local public school, it sounds like Marian, who went to public school herself, could just attest and say, like, look, what is typical in modern education is an idea of discovery learning, where they're not actually going to teach you content. They're going to make you go out and figure it out yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm trying to provide for you in your education is a structured way of understanding the world where people before us have gone through and have sort of analyzed how the world is and figured out what the structure is. And then I'm presenting that to you in a way that you can understand that and quickly master that, as opposed to going out and having to figure it out yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that immediately is I think an attractive thing to a student. Is like, oh, you're going to tell me what I need to know, and I'm going to be able to learn that, and I'm going to be able to be successful, as opposed to you're 10 years old, go do a research project on, World War I. I mean, because those things happen in school, right? I don't even know where to start as a student. And so I think like that's, I mean, we're kind of talking about with truth, beauty, and goodness, and objectivity versus subjectivity, right? And the idea of formation. That's one thing. The way the content is structured is a different thing about classical education, right? And I think that's with your younger kids. That's the conversation you want to have. Is like, I didn't get this when I was a child. It was all really confused for me, and but we're giving you grammar rules that are clear and concise so that you can be successful.
And the other thing is that I was thinking earlier too, that we're sitting here talking and we both have a philosophy background, and I can see a parent out there thinking, okay, yeah, you guys are philosophers, so you can talk about it, but that's the thing. You don't need to think about it all that much. If you're doing Latin, if you're doing logic with programs like ours that set it down how you do it, they're going to get that.
And can you give a couple
philosopher
examples? Can you say, okay, she said she's used MP for over 10 years. Can you think of an example that she could give and say, hey, Latin, for example?
Okay.
Or logic.
Match a Latin adjective to the noun it modifies.
Yeah.
You have to know the 5 cases, right? Because you got to match in case.
Yeah.
They got to match in number. There's 2 of those, singular and plural. And it's got to match in case and gender, which there's 3. That's 30 steps. Okay. That's like, just that's one simple thing, and it's all over Latin instruction. If it's done grammatically, rather than just conversationally, you don't really learn all that stuff if you're just doing conversational.
But to show that to the student when they're learning how to make an adjective and noun agree would be overwhelming, right? That's why we don't point that out. But to point that out to a student after the fact of like, look at what you can do. But here's the thing. Kids don't know what their peers don't know.
Yeah, Latin, that's hard, is not a thing they necessarily know to say.
Right.
Yeah.
And I remember, because I was homeschooled up through 5th grade, and I went to a private school for 6th grade, and then a different private school for 7th grade, and then I went off to a boarding school after that. And in all 3 of those schools, Latin was a core subject. And so I thought, going off to this boarding school, everybody takes Latin. I had a neighbor that I hung out with like every day, and he went to the public school. I just assumed he was learning Latin. Okay. And maybe maybe I'm just a dunce. I don't know. But I feel like this is a general universal child experience. You assume everybody else has a life just like you. And when I got to the boarding school and I realized they were putting me back into Latin level 1 because they just assumed nobody learned Latin. And I was like, wait, not everybody learns Latin? And it was just, it was shocking to me. And so sometimes these conversations with your students, like in some ways you have to point out, like, go ask your friend if they know how to make an English subject and verb agree a number, or even if they know what those words mean. Because they don't see the like they know what they're getting, but they don't see what they're not getting, or the absence, the lack of what they could be getting. So I think that's an important thing for kids to realize. And they will eventually. I mean, but sometimes, I mean,
I never told, we homeschooled mostly. And I never told my kids why we were doing it or what they were getting. They just got it. And then, like you say, they kind of assumed that other people got the same kind. We were just doing what they were doing in school at home.
Right.
No, actually.
Yeah, I do like your point though, Martin, about like because when I started teaching the philosophy class at HLS, or when I taught classical studies, I'd always start the year off, and most time we go through a trimester or semester break, we'd come back and I'd reiterate, why are we studying this subject, right? And that's not as broad as a conversation of why are we educating classically. It's more of a, why are we doing history? And I think that's helpful, especially for high schoolers to know, like, this is why we're doing this. This is why we're learning Latin. This is why we're learning, geography or whatever we're doing. But that's a wholly different conversation, because it's a much more targeted one of, hey, why are we learning literature?
And I've done that too, but they've never seemed to really be satisfied with the reason I give. They're only satisfied with it after they've done it and they look back and they realize what they know now that they didn't know before.
So how, Martin, I'm curious, did you handle any resistance if they just didn't want to do it? Was there a way in that you that you helped explain, this is why this is important?
Well, yeah, I mean, you give those things because then at least I guess they've got an answer and they know that there is an answer, even though it doesn't totally satisfy them.
Yeah.
But because my teaching experience is different from a lot of other people's teaching experience, because I was at first, I founded a school that met one day a week. It was homeschoolers. And then later we founded Highlands, and it was at first a 2-day week school, homeschoolers mostly. And, now it's a full school. So it's somewhat different, but, I didn't get much resistance. Okay. Their parents sent them there, and they thought they were supposed to do what they're supposed to do, and they pretty much did that.
And that's a good point. And if
they didn't do it, it wasn't because they were resistant; it was because they were lazy.
Right. And children will. Whatever their norm is, they'll go through it without asking questions. Adults do that, right? Whatever your routine is, off you go. And so, generally speaking, the times that we have to explain why we're doing something, probably in effect needs to happen less frequently than we think it needs to happen. Just because of that. Hey, I started here in kindergarten, and then, and I didn't ask questions because I'm 5 years old, and I did it in first grade, and I don't ask questions because I did it last year,
Well, and the other thing also, like with logic in particular, and some of those more metaphysical concepts that are really from material logic rather than formal logic, which are in the formal logic, at the beginning of the formal logic program, like the predicables and the categories, you apply them to things in life. You take something that it looks so abstract, but then you apply it to a specific situation. The Porphyrian tree, you can apply that to issues like animal rights and human rights and on all those things. And all of a sudden, then this thing that was so abstract when you first looked at it, it actually explains a lot of things that are going on in life. So that's another thing too. It's just applying things
absolutely
to their experience.
Augustine makes that point in his work on teaching the faith, that like you've got to make what they're learning. And he's particularly talking about the faith, but applies universally to their lives, right? And if you don't do that, then it's going to become a dead letter, right? Because they don't see why this is meaningful or how it's actually applied. So that it's so important to do that sort of application. And it's rather shocking to my students, but I do it because it's shocking. But when in philosophy class, when we're talking about substantial change, I talk about my dog Frank when he became a cadaver. And it evokes a lot of emotion, but then you realize like substantial change has real effects in the world. And then what I related to as a pet, how do I relate to it after it's died? Right? And does that make sense?
That may be the same or different to a human being who has
died. And that's the next step, right?
Yes.
And so we could just talk about substantial change as an idea, but once we start saying, okay, in this moment when this thing changes, all of a sudden, you see their eyes just kind of, they bug out because I'm using such a shocking example, but it's also they're realizing there's actually something here that's going to change the way I see the world and the way I interact with it.
With a
Right,
really
and-
tangible example.
Right. And something I mentioned the porphyry tree before, which is just a division of things in the world. There's non-material substances like an angel.
Mhm.
There are material substances like a rock. There are living material substances like a plant. There are sentient living material substances like an animal. And there are rational sentient living material substances, which are human beings. And now each of those things are fundamentally different from each other, which has a lot of implications on a lot of things. I mean, like evolution seems to be, pure evolution seems to be not really rational in the sense that if evolution was, then why is there such a huge division between each of those? Wouldn't it be just
A gradation.
a gradation? And it's not. Okay. And then you talk about, like these animal rights people who think that we should treat animals the same as human beings. No, not necessarily.
Mhm.
And you bring in Chesterton's remark that, if you assert that we should treat animals the same as human beings, that also means that we should treat human beings the same as animals. And that's a problem in our world. So it's those kind of things that if you bring those aspects of things out, those real life applications, that you get into a discussion about it. They're interested in that, and you apply the principles that you just taught them, and they realize, oh, okay, that's kind of useful.
Yeah.
That's really helpful to hear. I'm putting myself in Marian's shoes, imagining I have a 13-year-old, and I can already find things that I could imagine she could draw out from even the day before when they were studying, whether it was logic or Latin or science or whatever it is. So I think that these are really helpful tips to say, even go back from what did you discuss over the week and how did that come to bear on just your studies, but also the way you see the world as a 13-year-old. But in the mind of the parent, she knows this is a big picture investment in the formation of my child.
And it was, and sometimes like the defense for why we're doing one thing. I mean, I remember giving a talk to a homeschooling or like a 1 day a week school kind of crowd. And I talked about algebra and what algebra is and how algebra, is, it's finding a variable, but it's an abstraction also of geometry. You can prove, different, it's a shorthand way of doing things. And a dad came up to me after that and he said, thank you for that explanation, because every night my kid has been coming home and I've been saying things like, why are you studying algebra? And so like the father was undermining, right, the kid's desire to learn. And he said, but now I understand it. And now I can encourage my son in his learning of it. And so, even in those conversations that you have of the application, you need to know why. Don't just say, well, everybody learns algebra in 8th grade, so we're going to learn algebra, right? Like as a parent, you want to have some sort of defense, but at the same time, then when you're doing that study and then you say, okay, now what we're actually doing is we're finding a variable. So let's plug in like in reality, when we need to, figure something out, can our algebra help us? Right. And all of a sudden the kid sees there is an application here. And, so, I mean, I think,
well, and the irony is, it used to be that you didn't have to explain all this stuff. You knew that a really educated person knew Latin and Greek, at least Latin.
And knew mathematics.
And knew mathematics. And that's just what you learn to be a learned person. And so now we're in the situation where everything's been thrown up into the air.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to figure it out again. And we all want to be experimental. And then we start complaining about the things that we're not doing, the consequences of the things we're not doing anymore. That's the whole critical thinking skills movement is a result of the fact that we abandon things like Latin study and logic study and that sort of thing. And now we can't think anymore and we're wondering why. Okay. And then we come back with, hey, we've got a solution. And they're perceiving it as, new solution, something new. No, it's something we used to do and we don't do anymore. And that surprises some people, but I think that's where we are.
Passion. If you don't have to have these conversations, if you're passionate about what you're teaching too, So for teachers and for parents, if you come in and it's clear that you love this, those kids aren't going to ask a question about why they're doing it. They're like, I just love that.
Yeah, because probably what we hear more of anything else, teachers asking these, not students.
That's interesting.
Teachers asking these questions. They don't know why teaching these things is important, and they're working hard at doing it, and they're trying to, but why are we doing it?
And they don't see, and that's where homeschooling parents actually have an advantage here of being able to see the big picture, right?
That's right.
And whereas a teacher can get siloed into, this is my one subject and I don't see how that fits in. But a homeschooling parent can see the big picture, but that means the homeschooling parent also has a larger load of having to understand why they're doing each individual piece, right? And so perhaps for Marian, maybe this is something that she's feeling more, she wants the answers for. It's not, she doesn't necessarily need to turn and explain it to her kids in the way that she needs answered.
And this is not just a problem with why teach the subjects. It's why teach the subjects the way we teach them.
Yes,
so you have somebody who's supposed to be teaching Latin, and they're saying, well, what's wrong with an immersion approach to Latin? And they don't understand that if you do it that way, you're missing the whole grammar study out of it. We don't even do much English grammar study because it's all in the Latin. It takes care of so many things. They don't know, teachers. They don't know any of that. Why teach traditional logic as opposed to modern mathematical logic? Well, because they're actually very different. They're doing very different things, and you have to explain that to them. So I spend a lot of my time explaining this to teachers who don't know it.
And I do think our conversation today will be helpful to teachers. I mean, Marian's a teacher in her home, but even it makes me think of our Sidalitas breakouts and all, this is where we explain those things.
Absolutely.
But this is a bite-sized version of a lot of those big picture.
Yeah, that's right. Because those sessions, Martin mentioned Latin grammar. I was actually just asked for this year's Sidalitas to do a session on like the connection between Latin and English and why we would teach Latin through English and I've been asked to give particular examples of where that comes up, like how you see that. And so like we do dig into the nitty-gritty there, but I don't know that, insofar as like a big picture sort of covering formation and virtue and subject by subject, that kind of thing that I think this conversation has been really helpful for. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add?
Covered a lot of ground there.
We did.
We covered a lot of ground. I would say that a thought that this is just a look into Paul's mind, but a thought that goes through my head sometimes when I'm at homeschool conventions and I have a long conversation with a parent about like why they should be teaching Latin or something. And they seem convinced. And then they say, well, I need to go get my child and see if they want to do it. And the thought that goes through my head is you get to make that decision for them. Right. And I understand when they're juniors and seniors and you're trying to make them independent and move them towards, a life post high school or into college, whatever. I do get that you do want to make sure you have buy-in. But sometimes that happens so early that I'm like, no, you just need to tell your child this is what we're doing. And as Martin pointed out earlier, like in doing it, they will start to realize that they're getting good things out of it.
Yeah, if it's required that you give them an exhaustive explanation of why you're doing it that will be acceptable to the child, good luck with that.
That's right. Well, gentlemen, I enjoyed our conversation. And thank you for tuning in with us and joining us. We hope that the big picture and the practical tips are helpful to you with your children and with your students, whether it's a classroom, in your home, or in a school setting. We hope that this was helpful to you, and we hope that you join us again soon.
Thank you for watching this episode of Classical Etc. Please consider liking or sharing this video or commenting below to let us know what you thought. This has been Classical Etc. with Memoria Press. We'll see you next time.